Now we're going to have a sort of philosophical reflection on Roger Scruton. But before we do that, I'd just like to say to Sophie and to Sam, and please pass on to Lucy, that I've been thinking of you all this last day and today, and send you all my love and solidarity. And Sophie, thanks for the Christmas card. And certainly I would also like to add that, interestingly, Roger admired Kant more than Hegel. That's a very interesting thing about him, that the reconciliation of rights was really important to him, and that the virtues of his life, for me, were his courage, his civility, and his curiosity. And there's certainly three areas, and I'd just like to ask Remi about it. Is the three areas where he made a unique contribution, I think, to philosophy, were something that's been mentioned here. The first is the idea of home, his reflection on oikophilia, on the idea of exile and return as the dominant theme, not only in the Odyssey, but also repeatedly in the Bible, the other great source here. And you think of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Egypt, return, and those things. So I'd like to discuss that. The other was in the sphere of certainly aesthetics, where I think his work was remarkably original, and the idea of the sacred and the sensual in combination. I think that's a very profound area that he developed, a very original thing. There's obviously, you could talk about wine, you could talk about horses, you could talk about hunting, but the third area which engaged his passions was housing and architecture, and there particularly the way that the professional architects and the property developers decimated over the last 40 years a very central idea of home, and his championing of self-built homes, of using local materials, local builders, community land trust, was very interesting. The most profound conversations I had with him, though, and this relates very much to what Robert was saying, was it's not only the state that is parasitic and destroys custom, tradition, and belonging, it's also the market. The market also tries to commodify creation, and one of the outstanding lacunae in Burke was not seeing that, although obviously his work with the East India Company indicates that he felt it strongly. And that was where Roger and I were really engaging in a really profound conversation about how to strengthen society, what's called civil society, and the bonds of obligation through a renewal of the idea of covenant. So I just wanted to share that. So Remi, is there anything that you would like to say? You're still on mute. Oh, great.
Okay, can you see my mug?
Certainly.
My voice?
Yep.
Well, as a matter of fact, I had prepared a talk of sorts, and I'm afraid I won't be able to read it. This would be, well, would bore the pants of you. But the point I would like to make about Sir Roger, whom I had the pleasure to meet 3 or 4 times in my life in different countries, different times. First time in Poland, of all places, and then even in Paris. Can you imagine? Well, what I find especially interesting in his conception of what conservatism is all about is his benevolence. I was deeply impressed by the book he wrote by the title of How to Be a Conservative. Well, he spends the half part of his time and the half part of the book in trying to elicit what is good in other intellectual stances, what is good in nationalism, what is good in socialism, what is good in internationalism, and so on and so forth. Well, and this is the typically conservative attitude towards reality, salvaging what is good while, well, cutting off what is rotten. But first of all, having a positive stance towards what can be rescued from each and every possible intellectual attitude, provided this attitude is supported by sound arguments. And there are sound arguments in socialism, in nationalism, in, well, you name it. And well, perhaps I could take up an idea from G.K. Chesterton, whom I like a great deal. I don't know whether Sir Roger was familiar with the work of Chesterton. Anyway, his idea of what an heresy is interesting. The conservative attitude is, in my opinion, the very contrary of an heresy. And heresy consists, and I'm playing on the etymology on the Greek etymology of the word, and I know full well that the etymology is, well, partly bunk. But anyway, an heresy consists in picking up a part of the truth and playing it against the other possible truth that could be a balanced weight of sorts. And heresy is always a choice. And this is, by the way, what the Greek word most literally says. Choosing something against something else. And focusing excessively on what is true. For what people pick up in an heresy, what I call an heresy, unless they are especially perverse intellectually, must be some truth. Now they look at one side of the truth and not of the other ones. And heresy is, well, you've been alluding to Hegel, you know. He has a conception of unilaterality, what is consists in looking at only one side of reality while neglecting the other ones. And conservatism is the very contrary of such a unilateral attitude. You know, we have to look at whatever is good. And well, when I drafted the talk I won't be able to give, I began with telling the story of how I became a conservative, or to be precise, how I realized that I had been a conservative for some time already. I had to undergo a rather heavy operation. And well, after the operation, the surgeon told me, well, we had to remove about 1 foot of your bowels. I could have removed more, but I uphold a conservative view of surgery. And thus, by this way, I discovered that conservative was a word of art for surgeons. And this means what is rotten must go, but what can do its job can stay, and even must stay. We are not allowed to remove what could go wrong. We only have to remove what does go wrong. And well, this is the very contrary of an intellectual stance, which unfortunately knew its heyday in my own country more than 2 centuries ago, i.e. starting from scratch, trying to do away with what is and to replace it with, well, something we imagine, something we well, try to build out of nothing from a clean slate. And this is exactly what a conservative won't do, because he or she knows that reality is fragile, that civilization is only a thin veneer that we have to keep with great care and not do away with. I stumbled recently on a passage in a novel by the Russian writer Turgenev. You know, his novel Fathers and Sons, which he wrote in the early 60s of the 19th century. And this is, by the way, the book in which the word nihilism and nihilist occur for the very first time in a literary work. And well, there is a dialogue between an old timer and a younger fellow. There's the generation of the fathers and the generation of the sons. And the young fellow says, we don't want to build, we simply have to destroy, to make room for what will hopefully arise. And now experience shows that it's far easier to destroy than to build. And for this reason, it's prudent in the philosophical meaning of the term, the Aristotelian meaning, as well as in the the meaning the word has in common parlance. It is prudent to try to avoid this kind of pitfall, i.e., starting from scratch. There is no such thing as scratch.
So thanks enormously, and it's worth mentioning here, Remi, Roger's love of the French language, of France, and his particular love of Paris, which he declared to be his favorite city in the world. Robert, is there anything that you wish to say?
Oh, hi, Robert.
You're on mute, so great.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, is it over to me, Lord Glasman?
Yeah, it's over to you.
Good, thank you. First I want to express my thanks to Fisher and to the Foundation for inviting me to be part of this wonderful event. I've enjoyed listening to all the speakers, and the wonderful memories of Roger have come flowing back as people have captured his tone and rehearsed some of his great insights and given us a picture of the man we knew and loved. Second, and most importantly, I want to say to Sophie and the family, just what a blessing Roger was in my own life as a friend. I really treasure the memories of that wonderful friendship with that wonderful man. And I speak here not only for myself, but for all his friends in Princeton, especially at the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, where Roger was a beloved figure. We had the privilege of hosting a conference in his honor in 2017, focusing on the vast range of Roger's work, from aesthetics to philosophy of mind to ethics and politics. It's very memorable. And for anyone who's interested, you can actually go to the James Madison Program website and look at some of the talks that are there on video, including Roger's own presentations. When Roger died a year ago, the New York Times asked me to do something for them by way of a tribute or commentary on Roger's life as they put it, a conservative philosopher. Well, Roger was widely known as a conservative philosopher, and it's certainly true that he was a conservative, and it's also true that he was a philosopher. What's more, many, though by no means all, of his philosophical views, especially those pertaining to politics, culture, and ethics, can, without offense to the truth, be labeled conservative. But if we're to do justice to the truth in full, it's necessary to explain with respect to any particular view that Roger held, the sense in which it's conservative. as opposed to, say, liberal or progressive or socialist or revolutionary or postmodern or avant-garde or transgressive. So Remi mentioned earlier, as some others have, Roger's views on economic matters, which were interesting for a conservative. If we may proceed via negativa, as the theologians say, Roger, for example, opposed communism, which he regarded as a soul-destroying abomination, and not just because it consistently failed to deliver the prosperity it promised. Indeed, he loathed all forms of socialism. So he found little to like, of course, in the Labour Party of his native Britain, even in the Blair era, or in the Democratic Party over here in the United States, even before its 21st century lurch leftward. Yet Roger was far from fully on board with the economic philosophy of the British Tories in the Thatcher era or the American Republicans, or the mainstream of the Anglo-American conservative movement for many years. First, he believed that Thatcherite, Friedmanite free market enthusiasm made economic policy too central, relying on it too much to solve the problems that we have in our social lives here and there. In this respect, he feared that the strict libertarian wing of conservatism, which became ascendant on economic questions in the late 80s, was making a central mistake that Marxism had made. It had become economistic. Second, though Roger believed in market mechanisms and fervently opposed central economic planning and what he judged to be the dependency-inducing welfare state, he also opposed dogmatic or reflexive opposition to regulating markets. Michael Gove was very good on this a few minutes ago. Regulations of various sorts are needed, he believed, to protect persons and their dignity, to guard crucially valuable institutions of civil society, what Burke, and as others have pointed out, if Roger was anything, he was certainly a Burkean, called the little platoons. And we've heard that phrase time and again today. And it's these little platoons, the institutions of civil society, the family, the church, the local community, that should, Roger thought, and I believe, play the primary role in matters of health, education, and welfare, and in transmitting to each new generation of a society the values and virtues that they need to lead successful lives and to be good citizens. In the common law tradition, which Roger, of course, venerated, such regulations are understood as justified for the sake of protecting public health, safety, and morals, and more generally serving the common good. In responding to Peter Robinson's question about pandemic regulations, this is exactly where Michael Gove went, and here he was very faithful in explaining Roger's perspective on these things. So Roger joined, interestingly, the iconic American neoconservative, Irving Kristol, a man of letters remarkably like Roger in many of his beliefs and attitudes, but unlike Roger in his personality and style. Roger joined Irving Kristol in giving capitalism 2 cheers, not 3. Indeed, perhaps Roger offered no more than 1 3/4 cheers. He regarded markets as necessary, but far from sufficient for the flourishing of social life. And he radically rejected the idea that an outcome was necessarily just or good because it was the outcome that the free market produced. Remember Michael Gove's comments a few minutes ago about a market in heroin. Well, he was very much in the spirit of Roger in making that point. And this was connected, I think, to Roger's belief that liberty, while a very important value, was not the only important value, indeed not the only important value to be taken into account in making political decisions. There were also such values as community and solidarity, order and decency, honor and faith. Such words and concepts bring us to Roger's thought on social life more generally. His willingness to ally himself with classical liberals and even Austrian school libertarians in the struggle about communism should not obscure a profound intellectual and moral difference that he quite self-consciously had with the libertarian wing of the conservative movement. Roger regarded individualism in any strict and serious sense to be misguided, Nothing was more fundamental to his thought about ethics and politics than the dignity of the human person. In this respect, he was very much like the Pope, John Paul II. But he understood persons not as atomistic individuals, but as social beings, beings whose telos, whose flourishing centrally includes their participation in relationships of various sorts, beginning with the intimate community of the family. Central to Roger's disagreement with his libertarian and even classical liberal anti-communist and anti-socialist allies was his firm belief in unchosen obligations. He agreed that one could, by contract or other form of agreement, create a genuine and fully binding obligation where there had previously been none. But he held that many of our most important obligations are natural, not contractual. We have them and they're stringent because we are human beings and therefore have certain duties and rights simply in virtue of our humanity. And in many cases, because we were born into a particular family, a certain tradition, say a tradition of faith, a certain community, a certain nation, and so forth. We come into the world not as Rawlsian, I'm here referring to the late liberal political philosopher John Rawls, not as Rawlsian unencumbered selves, tabula rasa, blank slates, as Remi might say, but as human persons, and therefore, yes, indeed, encumbered by relationships that are suffused with normative elements, such as rights and duties. Now, Roger was famous for being a leading philosophical exponent of what he called oikophilia. That's come up again today many times. Love of home and one's own. Now, of course, as a humanist and a Christian, how strictly orthodox is a question disputed even among Roger's close friends, of course. But Roger recognized duties to all humanity, not just to those near and dear. Duties that are, in a non-trivial sense, duties of love, understood now, love being understood not just as feeling, but as willing, volitional. All are, after all, brothers and sisters under the fatherhood of God, who made each and every member of the human family in his very own image and likeness. But Roger also held that one naturally and rightly has a special love and special duties toward those with whom one has special closeness as a member of the family or the shared tradition of faith, or a local community, or a region, or to one's fellow citizens or subjects. Roger's oikophilia, together with his rejection of multiculturalism, which Roger thought, rightly in my view, was actually anti-culturalism in that it melted the different cultures into a monoculture of contemporary upscale progressive ideology. But his oikophilia provoked ignorant and excitable people to accuse him of the sins of xenophobia and racism. That's come up today as well. The New Statesman scandal and all that nonsense. In fact, Roger respected cultures not his own a great deal more than many of his progressive critics ever did or do today. He learned Arabic in order to read the Quran, and he admired the tradition transcending contributions of the great Islamic philosophers of the Middle Ages. He made careful, in-depth studies of Hindu and other Eastern traditions of faith and thought precisely in search of the wisdom he thought they possessed. Roger often explained and defended his conservatism in a soundbite, which naturally oversimplifies matters. He told the story, of course, of watching the protesters from his room in Paris, Remi, from the window in 1968. And there, of course, he was struck, as is famous, by the insight that, gosh, it's very easy to tear things down. Very easy. Very hard to build them up. So we should be careful about what we destroy. This was the essence, of course, of Roger's conservatism. And that was the moment when he realized that he was, in some meaningful sense, a conservative. Moreover, Roger recognized that the most important things people build, even more important than the cathedrals and great works of art and music that Roger so loved, are not primarily the result of a thought-out plan and its execution. They are rather built or developed organically over time with a certain amount of trial and error, the work of many hands. An example, of course, is his beloved common law of England. Now, recognizing this, conservatives should, he argued, seek to protect those things against those who, out of a misguided zeal for, you name it, could be liberty, could be equality, could be fraternity, could be social justice, or even respect for the free market, tear them down. The conservative can tolerate and even cheer moderate reforms. Organic things, after all, do grow and therefore change. But the conservative's fundamental goal is to conserve. That spirit, by the way, made Roger an ardent but old-fashioned, and as such moderate conservationist, a kind of green Tory who saw the importance of nature conservancy and responsible stewardship of the natural order. He thought that began with regard for the landscape and architecture of the local community. It's classic, standard, beautiful Roger. Now, left-wing philosophers, heirs in a sense to 1789, believe that the point of philosophy is to chart the ways in which the world should be remade. Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach made the point famously, quote, "The philosophers have thus far merely interpreted the world. The point is to change it," unquote. Well, as if to play the role of Marx's straight man for one of his pithiest lines, some conservative philosophers have sought to explain that the world, or at least the social world, is as it is because it had to be that way and cannot be substantially changed. Roger was a different kind of conservative philosopher. True, he did not think that philosophy or anything else could intelligently and usefully plan the world or chart its radical reform. He was not a Marxist even in that narrow sense. There was nothing in Roger of the spirit of 1789 or 1968. But he believed that philosophy can and should help us to understand the value of good, if necessarily imperfect, because human things. Communities, institutions, systems, social orders. Things that have grown up more or less organically over time, with lots of trial and error. And he thought that this could show us why we should labor, even fight, to preserve those good, even if imperfect things. And that we should all try to make our own little modest contribution to their development, sometimes even by way of moderate reforms. Thank you, Lord Glasman.
Really, thank you, Robert. That really gave excellent flavour. There's one thing I want to engage with you on, and I don't know if it came out in Roger's talks at Princeton, but he was fundamentally anti-revolutionary. You know, he thought that all revolutions ultimately were blind to historical continuities, that they led to violence, and that they disrupted what you call the work of many hands and the organic development of things through time. Which brings me obviously to the American Revolution. I mean, are we seeing playing out now the impossibility of conservatism in America because the Constitution is so inherently liberal that the separation of the powers, well, you know, he loved the ancient Constitution with the balance of interests rather than the separation of the powers, that the primacy of individual rights within that Constitution. And also, to go back, he had that very profound critique of free market economics. That also undermined tradition, it undermined family, it disrupted obligation, and it desecrated the natural environment, which was seen within that. To what extent do you think that Roger had something profound to say about or would have had something to say about the circumstances now in America? How can there be a genuine conservatism in America is the question I'm asking.
Yeah, so the question is, or another way of putting your question, Lord Glasman, is America fundamentally liberal in a sense that would preclude its being at the same time conservative.
There you
I
go.
think
You've,
there
you've
probably
answered
is
my
a sense
question.
in which American conservatism, and not just the conservatism of the 1980s, but the older tradition of American conservatism, that American conservatism is a sort of old-fashioned liberalism. It's conserving old-fashioned liberal values.
Yeah.
But those values are in a great many cases values that Roger shared.
Mm.
These are private property, the independence and autonomy and authority of the institutions of civil society, the authority of parents, of families, of churches, and so forth. Private property, the rule of law, some participatory role of citizens in shaping their common destiny and so forth. One of the most memorable discussions, debates that I ever had with Roger was a sort of classic one between an American, and it was a private one, not a public debate, but one of these over the dinner table debates, classic one for an American and an Englishman. It was really about whether the American Revolution was, as I contended, a conservative revolution, and therefore to be contrasted with the French Revolution, which was a radical revolution. And my argument was the American Revolution should be counted as a conservative revolution because it meant to restore ancient rights and understandings that had been disrupted. And Roger was inclined to think, as I suspect an Englishman might, that there's really no such thing as a conservative revolution.
Yeah.
That's worse than a paradoxical or oxymoronic idea.
Contradictory rather than paradoxical, yeah.
Yeah, it's a contradiction that if it's a revolution, you're overthrowing the existing order. It's not a conservative revolution. And yet, I have to tell you, Roger loved America. There was maybe he disliked the idea of America more than he liked the actual America. He felt at home, I think it's fair to say, over here. Or if he didn't, he did one heck of an acting job of persuading all of us of how much he loved being in America and among Americans and interacting with Americans and speaking up for some of the same values that patriotic Americans hold dear and now find, of course, under terrific assault, especially from, but not exclusively, but especially from the left.
Really thanks, and Robert, I hope we can continue the conversation. We're coming to an end now. Remi, is there any reflections you'd like to make about the reflections on the revolution in France, for example?
Oh, very much so. Well, you know, I happen to be a proud citizen of the Grande Nation. And for this reason, I'm allowed to have a critical look at the past of my own country. Well, you've put your finger in your talk recently on a very important word, which was one of Sir Roger's favorite words: continuity. Continuity, you know, the very contrary of the idea of a radical new beginning. And well, I stumbled some years ago while reading the preface to, well, I'm afraid I don't remember which book it was. The preface had been penned by a fellow who had quite an interesting surname, Dupont White. Dupont, the typically French surname, and White, which is typically British. And well, he might have been bilingual, by the way, this fellow. And I read under his pen, he's at present totally forgotten, unless among some historians of ideas. And he wrote this amazing sentence, which could have been the motto of Sir Roger's whole endeavor. Continuity is a right of man. Continuity is a human right, which means that, well, each and every human being has a right to have had a past, to have a backdrop on which he or she can do what he or she wants. having a, well, I dislike the word roots, because of the, well, the static idea that underlies the use of roots. We are not plants. We may be trees, the roots of which are upward, are towards the heaven, as Plato has it in the Timaeus. But I would prefer the image of source, something that flows, something to which we have actively to get back in order to fetch what we need in order to quench our thirst. And well, continuity is the basic issue in my own conception, my modest conception of what conservatism is all about. Not trying to break, not trying to weigh anchors, but going on, probably changing direction. We are not programmed, we are not robots, we are not machines, not yet. Not yet, but we can change. We can go, well, this way or the other way, but we can't. There's I don't remember who said we can jump into the void, but we can't jump from the void.
Yeah.
We must have some, well, some point of departure. And well, the conservative stance consists in respecting this point of departure, correcting it. I come back to the surgical image I pointed out at the beginning. What is rotten must go. What is not, well, we have no special reason to get rid of it. On the contrary, we have to care for it. We have to, well, try to enable it to play its part in a more forceful, more efficient way, but we can't get rid of it. For this would mean we would get rid with ourselves.
So really, thank you very much, Remi, and I think that's a much better image than the tree or the vegetable is the river and the source, and how Roger did replenish the source. And to Robert, I really hope we continue. I mean, I'm a socialist, I'm a Labour peer, and no one gave me more than Roger in trying to understand that so much of this was a resistance to a revolutionary idea, and in which both state and market were accomplices, most particularly in relation to housing. His desire to give communities control over their housing was extremely important. Much more to say, but I'm aware it's getting late. So, Robert, thank you so much. Remi, merci beaucoup. Really, thank you very much. And to say thank you again to Fisher, and I now hand over to Fisher to wind up proceedings. Thank you both.
Thank you, Lord Glasman.
My pleasure.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Maurice. Thank you, Remi. Thank you, Robert. Thank you to all of our speakers. It was just a lovely event and a lovely reflection on who Roger was and what he did and what he thought. I wish we had more time to continue all these conversations. There's so much more, I think, to explore, to look at, to discuss, and to consider when considering who Roger was and what his legacy is. But the best thing I think we can do to end it, the only thing I have to offer, I think, here at this moment, is just to read a quote from Madeline Grant's piece in the Telegraph over the weekend. She, I thought, ended her reflection on Roger and his life beautifully. She says, "I believe Scruton lived a life properly, with generosity and open-mindedness, welcoming debates and seeking beauty in everyday things. It's hard to find meaning in a seemingly rudderless, uncertain world, but we owe it to him to try." And I hope you'll join me and join the foundation and join all of us as we try to honor Roger's legacy and try to honor his life and continue to pursue beauty and the home and the family and these things that matter and give us meaning. So with that, I thank you all. For those of you who stayed the full 2 hours, I think we have about 400 still online. I'm very grateful and hope you really enjoyed and like me, were moved by the many conversations and reflections on Roger.
We sure did.
Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you,
Everyone.
Richard, and bless
Thank
you
you.
all.